Okay, Bismillah, Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the latest IlmFeed podcast episode, where we meet inspiring Muslims from our community who we can benefit from. And my guest today fits squarely into that category. My guest today is Sister Someera Butt. She's the head teacher of Al Noor Primary School, one of the best schools in the UK, mashallah, where she has served since 2003. She is also a long-standing board member of the Association of Muslim Schools, UK. She was a science teacher and graduated from Imperial College in physics, where she also completed a master's in theoretical physics. Someera has delivered circles and been involved in da'wah in the community for a long time, mashallah. She's also the mother of 4 children and a grandmother to 3 granddaughters, mashallah. Assalamu alaikum, Someera.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Yeah, they're at home at the moment waiting for me.
You know, when you mentioned that to me, it was like, oh my God, I just hadn't realised that so much time had gone past.
Yeah, doesn't it? Yeah, it goes by so quickly.
Yeah, because I think we met, didn't we, at school. We met at school at Islamia when I was a slightly older sixth form student. I had taken 2 years out after GCSEs and come back. And you were a science teacher there, right?
Science teaching and sixth form lead at the time. Yeah.
Mashallah.
Yeah. And it feels like yesterday to me, or another, you have phases or stages in your life, and that was a few epochs ago, and here we are.
I just
today.
remember you feeding 2 little kids after school. You know, you had Anisa and your son, and you would just be feeding them a snack after school, and mashallah, with you is Hudhayfah, your son, who you were head teacher of, right?
Yeah, he was at the primary
mashallah,
school. Yeah.
He was at the primary school, and he's studying law at the moment, mashallah. And he was also a mentor at your school, I hear.
Yes, he's done some volunteering at the school actually a number of times now, and that's wonderful because we like to bring back in our ex-pupils to inspire the next generation. Obviously, I'm getting a bit advanced in my years, and children feel inspired by youngsters, and it's lovely to have ex-pupils come back and speak to pupils, mentor them, give them an example, and become role models for them. Of course, we all are as staff, but it's extra special when you get youngsters back in to do that. So it's an honour for me to bring him back in and obviously make good use of him at the school.
MashaAllah. I remember Hudhayfah as head boy of
head of what was it?
Or
head council.
It was head of the school council, student council, head of student council.
But the way you spoke and the way you conducted yourself, I actually thought you were head boy. So mashallah.
That was Isa actually. I remember him.
Of my son's school. So mashallah, you've been a really great role model. I'm always telling my sons, about former students at the school and saying, remember so-and-so, you've got to be like them. And so Jazakallah khairan for coming as well.
Yeah, a pleasure.
Someera, just while we were praying out there, I actually started feeling quite emotional because we stood very close together, feet to feet, shoulder to shoulder. And I remember that's what we used to do in the 90s. And since then, I guess I've been in different circles of Muslims and who don't necessarily do that practice. And it kind of took me back to the 90s, and it just reminded me of that, of some of the more positive aspects of that time, which were sisterhood, that desire to follow the sunnah, that real kind of fervour, I think, and just that closeness we used to feel when we used to pray together. Because now sometimes, when you try to get close to a sister in Salah, they sometimes pull away, right? So you can see that the culture's changed.
Yeah, but it's also about knowledge as well, and about intention. And what we witnessed today was the promise of Allah in the prayer and the Sunnah, and clearly whatever the Prophet ﷺ did and instructed us was of benefit to us. And certainly in the realm of ibadah, if we allow it to seep into us, if we allow it to affect us, if we try to stand in khushu', if we have sincerity that we are praying in a particular way because just in an endeavour to follow the Prophet ﷺ because we love Allah, we want Allah to love us, then we'll reap the benefits. We'll start to taste some of the sweetness of that, and that's the mercy. Allah knows He created us, and He, Al-Khaliq, made us in a certain form, in a certain way, and He knows what will affect our hearts. One of the things is to stand close together when engaged in worship.
MashaAllah. Yeah, it just really took me back to that time. And I mean, I started to think, I've never really met a sister I haven't met a sister for a long time who was active in dawah during the 90s and, beyond, who I could ever sort of share notes with, I guess, and kind of reflect on what were the positives of that time. Because sometimes, like, we hear about the negatives of that time. There was a lot of division in some ways, and there was a lot of toxic type, name calling and pointing fingers and
ghulu,
that kind of thing.
In some ways, it was a ghulu, and it was an immaturity of. If I use the word "our" very generally, very loosely, but of our iman as a community and our knowledge. But I think there was also that freshness, that sincerity, that desire to worship Allah, that desire to do the right thing. Unfortunately, in some cases, it seemed to translate into to do the right thing, to be seen of other people, and to know you're on the sunnah and you're, and that's the struggle each of us are constantly going through. Why do we do what we do? Why do we say what we say? Why do we hold ourselves in the way we hold ourselves and behave in the way we do? Is it to impress people? Is it so that people will say of us, wow, or say of us, or not criticize us? Are we scared of the people? Do we care about what they think about, or is it about Allah? Now, of course, in life, there's a balance to be struck, isn't there? There is a little bit of caring about what the people say. There's a little bit of that. But we don't let that supersede the ultimate intention for everything, which should be seeking the face of Allah, seeking His pleasure. And so there was all of that in that immaturity. There was a lot. But then, who am I to judge anybody else and what I can't see inside their hearts. We can't see what was each person's intention for why they behaved the way they did, or made the mistake they did, or became a little bit ghulu. I'm going to use that word rather than another. It has better connotations, I think, for those who understand the word. Why those things happened. But at the end of the day, there was the positivity when people turn to Allah, when they want to know, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say in the Quran? What did the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam say? What did he do? And those things were positive.
There was a rawness, I think. Recently, a PhD student interviewed me for her PhD and thesis, and she was asking me about that time, like, what is it about the generation that grew up in the UK, so the children of the immigrants. I'm assuming you're one of those, right? Same as me. What was it about us that instead of becoming more diluted as a community, right, and losing our iman and basically assimilating, or what was it about us that actually it was the opposite, that we actually, in many cases, the parents were not the religious ones or not particularly knowledgeable, and then the children of those immigrants ended up having so much more fervor, so much more kind of visible adoption of Islam. So what are your thoughts on that?
Quite complicated. I'm not a sociologist or a behavioural scientist, but
just your reflections.
A lot of those. If you think about what people are going through, what children are going through in my generation or before me, you don't quite belong, do you? And the messages, the feedback that you get from society constantly about who you are. You're told on the one hand you're a full and equal British citizen, but on the other hand your lived experience sort of tells you back, no, actually, you need to be different here, and you need to behave differently there, and you're not going to be accepted there. And as you leave school, that becomes more and more of a reality. And I think children go through that experience, and that affects the way they see the world. For some children, it will allow them, if they have their world, if they have each foot in a different cultural and religious, different cultural heritage, it will allow them to be able to take the bigger picture view of that. Not everybody, but a number did. And a number of them did stand back and have a look at that picture and try to find their own sense of identity and purpose within that. And perhaps that's some of it. That's some of it, you know. At the end of the day, of course, there were some fantastic things in traditional parenting, traditional families, things that constantly, as we move further and further away from previous generations, we tend to see increasing views. Perhaps that's about living in more and more of a consumerist sort of model of society. The more that we become, you know, grow up and emerge into this sort of consumerist vision for the family, the more that we become materialistic, the more that we lose our connection with Allah, lose our ability to be able to see His signs around us, a connection to the divine. And as that happens, then, you know, the world takes over, and the concerns of the world take over. And I think in previous generations, where people knew how to knit, sew, use, you know, grow food in the land, and so, you know, our parents had those skills, and we thought, I remember thinking, this is really boring. But learning to weed, learning to plant things, learning to grow, even though not very much came back, learning to knit, even though I never made anything very much. I think I may have knitted a jumper once. But all of those skills that I learnt from my mother, am I passing them on now to my children? And as a grandmother, you know, is my daughter passing them on to her children? And, you know, you see this dilution of people being able to live independently from a supermarket.
No, absolutely. I mean, you know, you've given us a lot to think about. So it made me wonder what your experience of growing up was like. Were you a Londoner? Did you grow up in London? Which area of London was it?
Leighton, East London.
What was that like?
What was that like? Well, back then, and this is some time ago, it was still, I you know, grew up through the 70s, and I was sort of aware of things through the 80s, and that's when I was going to school, etc. And 80s was a time of multiculturalism, but preceding that, alongside with that, there was a lot of open racism actually on the streets before it became illegal. So as a child in the 70s, I remember my mother being spat at by a group of individuals who were walking behind us. I think this is a story I heard back from my sisters who'd gone with my mother to the park. So I don't think I actually witnessed it, but I was horrified when I got home and they told me that they were calling them, of course, the usual terms of reference at that time for anybody who was brown, anybody else that they could get away with saying it to, and spat actually at my mother. And those things were not uncommon, and I think a lot of people at that time, the 70s and 80s, my mother was very risk averse. She was kept us in. She was very risk averse, and I think a lot of people were. A lot of people from, you know, different communities, Muslim communities that were settling down and living here, were quite risk averse. They were sort of
Pakistani background, is that?
My own family, my mother and father. Yeah.
What I was thinking about was, if you did live in another country, as in the country from maybe where, and going further up the family tree, they resided from Pakistan or wherever. Do you think your mother would have been so risk averse living there, given the cultural differences between those places and where we live now?
I think she would have been less, but she is a bit as a person, she's quite risk averse.
Yeah. I think referencing the point you made earlier about how it didn't lead to a dilution of our beliefs. I think that whether it's subconsciously or they did it explicitly, expressly, and, you know, intending to do it, it kind of created sub-communities or communities within communities where people already felt left out and different, given their cultural differences from wherever they migrated from, coming here. And for the more inquisitive of the individuals, not to say that there aren't people who aren't inquisitive, that led those individuals to wonder what gives rise to these cultural differences and what gives rise to a certain way of living here compared to a certain way of living there. You know,
and yet there were others as well who wanted so much to fit in, and not be for them. The drivers were all about fitting in, or even eating of the fruit, you know, of society, and getting to the top there and doing whatever it takes.
Probably that ultimately leads to a question of what grounds the way the people there do live, and what grounds the way the people here live. And obviously, you referenced it previously, that what grounds the way we live here in the West, whether that's here or America or any, you know, Western European country. It's the whole notion of capitalism and consumerism, you know, to live in the now purchase now. Enjoy your time now, because you don't know what might come in the future, and it's best to just enjoy yourself now.
That sort of it's not just capitalism and consumerism, but they're all sorts
as
of
broader
strains.
concepts.
Yeah,
I think.
I don't know what you think about this. Let me know what you think. But my reflection on it is that growing up in the UK, we were faced with the question, "Who am I?" And any time a person is forced to ask themselves that question, they look around for the answer. And for us, I think we would have thought about our heritage, but then also the big questions of life, like, how am I going to view this? Am I going to view having a girlfriend? Am I going to view, all the different things that as a young person you face? You ask yourself, and then you go home, and then you either talk to your parents about it, and they give you an answer, or you start researching. And I think one of the great things about growing up in Britain was this emphasis on reading, this emphasis on critical thinking, questioning. And I think so much of what our generation learned was through books, not necessarily through our parents.
Yeah, we did a lot of reading.
Our parents taught us another aspect, which was very important.
But not everybody's a reader. Not everybody's a reader.
Or sometimes it was other people at school, right?
Well, I think for me, it was, all of that was part of the journey. But for me, mine was, and all praises for Allah, and obviously the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is our inspirational example, and the companions after them, and we just offer whatever little stories we do. But for me, it was the lap of my mother. And my mother taught us Iman on her lap. And she told us about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. She told us about heaven and hell. And I took that to heart as a very, very young child. By the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He answered my mother's dua, etc. And I can never thank my mother enough, because that was such a deeply rooted Iman from such a young age. I used to make dua. I'd ask her about, okay, so how long do we have to be in hell if we're bad and we go to hell? And well, if we were in hell, I'd imagine all of these things, and I'd start to say, well, if I really asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I'm really sorry now, and would we be able to leave? So I had all of these conversations with my mother. And it's funny, I just sort of remember back how even as a child, you'd almost think it's so easy to get to hell. This
Easier.
negativity that creeps in. Strange. But alhamdulillah, by the mercy of Allah, my mother, and by the mercy of Ar-Rahman, who gives hidayah to whoever He wills, this sort of led to a deep connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from a young age, and a desire to make sure everything I did was in line with what does Allah say about this? What does within whatever I could find out about it as a child. And my immediate source of knowledge was my mother. I mean, I talk a lot about my mother because my father died when I was very young. My father was sick for a very long time, and then he eventually died. He was sick with cancer for a very long time, and then he eventually died of pneumonia. And I was just turned 8 at the time. The youngest, there were 4 of us. So my sister was 5, my brother was 9, a year old, just before he turned 9 actually. He was only 10 or 11 months between us. My mother, had us quite close together. And there was my second sister, the third sibling, who was probably about 7 then. So we had no relatives at all. So that was, I only reflected on this about a year or 2 ago, how profound it was as an influential experience, how much it determined a lot of the way I was and the way I thought. Because of course death is the biggest teacher. It's not just a killer of joys, but it is the biggest teacher about what is life. Death teaches you what life is and what living is. Of course, there's that huge difference. Opposites always explain each other, don't they? But also the pain of losing your father, then understanding when your mother explains to you that Allah loved him and Allah took him, we all belong to Allah and we go back to Allah, and that was such a profound lesson at a very tender age, and so very influential in me. But I found that I didn't have to it was enough to know if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said this, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, of course, my journey, I started to read the Quran. I started to read it with English at quite a young age, actually, even before I could fully understand all of the English words. But I was always a very good reader right from the beginning, so that wasn't really a problem for me. So I was reading, and one of the surahs my mum would teach me to read a lot was Surah Yasin. She had the habit of reading Surah Yasin after Fajr. So I would read it after Fajr, and I would read the English eventually quite regularly. And of course, it's a very deep concepts of Aqidah, which are embedded throughout the Quran, which the more you read, and this is one of the benefits of فَذَكِّرْ إِنَّ الذِّكْرَ تَنْفَعُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ, that the reminder benefits the believer, and why we're told to recite again and again and again the Quran, because you will never, this is the word of Allah, you will never understand it on one reading, you will never grasp everything, and there's always something fresh, something new, something more. And as human beings with this sort of mind that flits, doesn't it? Flits. We grasp something different by the mercy of Allah every time we read it, something more, and something we didn't realise from before. So, I would read Surah Yasin and grasp these sort of basic points of Aqidah, and that's sort of where I started from. So it wasn't, for me, there was never a debate. There was not really a pull.
So you grew up in Leighton. When did you? I don't know about you, but because I'm thinking we've got kind of similar. Of course, subhanAllah, I'm just thinking about your mom, because I know my mom found it hard bringing up kids here, not knowing the language, with a husband, right? I just can't imagine, how it was for your mom. But I'm just thinking now, okay, so when did you? So you knew Islam, you knew Allah from the beginning, it seems, and you were aware of that. When did dawah come into your life? Like, was it something in primary school?
Just reading the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran, let there arise from your band that will encourage what is right and prohibit what is wrong. These are injunctions, they're instructions, and even in the English, they're very, very clear. Of course, it was the English for me for many years. And so it was the Quran primarily. And yes, I would try to read a hadith, and my mother tried to teach us, there were so many different things she was teaching us. When we started secondary school, we had one of those blessed schools, actually, even though it was a terrible school, a really bad school. But
what kind of school was it? Girls' school?
It was a girls' school. At that time, you had these middle schools, Key Stage 3 schools, where they weren't called Key Stage 3. Just I think a year after I left, they shut those down, and then they created these all-throughs from 11 to 16. But at that time, you had this sort of 11 to 14, year 7, 8, 9 they would now call. We used to call them 1, 2 and 3 then. And so I went to one of these, and it was absolutely terrible. Because they really had a behaviour problem. It was really bad.
The head teacher wasn't watching this.
It's a long time ago now. But alhamdulillah, a big blessing for us is that we had these Islamic studies morning classes. You came in half an hour early to school one day a week, and it was the Muslim Educational Trust. May Allah bless our earliest generations who set these things up for us. May Allah reward them. They strove for the sake of Allah, and they gave us messages and planted seeds that, we are a sadaqah jariyah for them too. So subhanallah, they would send a teacher. Now she was, mashallah, a wonderful woman, Mrs. Gosar Sheikh, well known in the Muslim community down in East London, probably further afield. She'd come every week, and her passion for the deen was really evident. And she would encourage anybody who had a liking for the deen. I was very outspoken from a very young age, actually. One of those who always had a hand up in class. I was outspoken in that class as well. I'd inevitably be chosen every year for the end of year speech at the annual event that they'd hold at this Muslim Educational Trust function, they'd call it every year. And I always give a little speech. I got my speech skills from. And I'd always normally I'd get top marks in the end of year exam for Islamic studies.
So is this like a Saturday school?
No, it was during the weekdays. Alhamdulillah. Oh. Yeah, one day a week before school started, we'd do this class.
What kind of things were covered?
So they had a book. The Muslim Educational Trust published a book.
I vaguely remember the Muslim Education Trust logo.
Yeah. May Allah reward them. Mashallah. What they did at that, it was such an inspired idea to send out these teachers. So it was by, you went there voluntarily if you wanted. If you didn't want, there were many girls who didn't go. There was a number who did, and obviously there were more at year 7, and then they'd drop off as time would go by. But I always went to these, and in fact, when I joined my secondary school, I started a class there, which very few girls came to in my secondary, meaning the one after this secondary, at 14. But may Allah reward and bless her. She did a lot. She went to a lot of schools, and she always had a passion for the deen, and she was always encouraging, giving advice, and may Allah bless her and reward her. She worked well with that school. And then obviously at home, my mother tried to teach me Urdu. She tried to teach all of us. And I really tried to learn Urdu. She'd taken us to Pakistan in the first time in my sort of years of awareness of what was going on. I was about 10. Yeah, I was 10 going on 11, I think. We went at the end in my year 6, what they now call year 6, last year of primary. And of course, we couldn't speak a word out there, and then picked up bits of Punjabi, because the family predominantly spoke Punjabi when they were, and then others spoke Urdu. And so, this mishmash that everybody would keep pointing out to us that we learnt and came back with. So then first she tried it herself, and then she appointed somebody to come home and teach us. And so I sort of tried to learn Urdu. And then my mother had some interesting books. And one I really remember is Marne ke baad kya hoga? Wow. What happens after death? I wanted to read that book. So I picked this book up and tried to read this book. So that's another way that I learned deen and improved my Urdu. I had to do it to understand this book. And I would read it to my mum. And it was quite a good book. It had, authentic hadith about how the soul's journey after death and so on. And that was really fascinating at that age. And obviously by that time, I think that was some 5 years. No, how many years after? No, I was probably 12? Was I 12, 11? So, that filled in the blanks about the soul's journey and so on. And for me, it was fundamental. Everybody should know this. Why isn't everybody wanting to So there were lots of ways through which. And then at my the next school I went to, I met a wonderful girl called Sabira. And if you're listening, Sabira, assalamu alaikum. I hope you're really well. Sorry for losing touch. She's really wonderful. Very different personality to me. I was the loud, extrovert, outspoken one. She was the quiet, calm, reserved, sensible one, mashallah. And we went through secondary together. And her father was involved, and her whole family in da'wah work. And mashallah, sort of had a connection there as well. And there was another organisation that I got involved with through them, and went to some circles, delivered some circles, started some circles, used to get local girls to come every week to my house, my mum's house. And primarily we do Quran tafsir, to be honest with you. We'd read the Quran starting from Surah Al-Baqarah and talk about the meanings and so on. And I would every week trying to get people to come to this circle on Sunday mornings. We used to do it.
What was the reason behind that? Was that the stage where this kind of divine injunction of promote the good and forbid the evil, is that when it started to manifest itself in you doing? No, that was from a younger age. Circles? Oh my goodness. The age that I just remember how terrible I was in primary school. People get that hulu stage where they've tried to push the religion down their family members' mouths, really in an aggressive, horrible way that really pushes everyone away. As a 10-year-old, I was doing that as a young child. Yeah, within my whatever power I had. Whenever they would listen. Well, at school, it was like there were 2 other girls in my class who sort of said they were Muslim, so it was sort of trying to push it on them. And Muslims must do this, and I'm sure we've all met people like that, children like that in primary who do that. And then in secondary, it was. Actually, I didn't know that hijab was fard. So, for example, and I was how old was I? I watched a program one day. It was about Muslim women in Egypt putting the hijab back on, and that's what told me that once upon a time, women in Muslim countries used to wear niqabs and burqas and what have you, and then they took them off through this period of, at the time I didn't realise, colonisation and what have you, and the colonising of the Muslim mind or the Muslim spirit or whatever. And then in the how old was I? It's probably early 80s. I was 12 or 13 when I watched this. And so they were interviewing these women who'd put the niqab and put the hijab back on. And that was what taught me a lot about the world, but also that hijab is fard. So I finished watching the programme and I shouted up the stairs to my mum,
I'm going to start wearing the hijab. I think at the time I called it scarf or dupatta or something. I'm going to start wearing that from now on. And Mum said, okay. I said, okay. And from that day forward, I there was this purple dupatta, I remember. That was the only thing I had. But I remember I wrapped it around my head and I would go to school every day. Then I had another battle at school having to explain this. I didn't go and explain it to, and it wasn't part of the uniform, this purple dupatta on top of a navy uniform. I had to go and explain why and how I should be allowed to do it and so on. And I went first to the deputy and then went to the head, and I remember, I think the head asked me, why didn't you come to me first? Why did you go to the deputy first? And that was an interesting thing that carried on in the school I went to beyond, because I had to we had to write a letter to the Board of Governors to be allowed to be able to wear hijab as a part of our uniform in school. Wow. And I remember feeling that we'd been double-crossed and hoodwinked because it never went. The head teacher ended up making a deal before the Board of Governor meeting and allowed us to wear, and it was Sabra and me, you see, so bring Sabra along, Sabra and me. We went there and she said, yes, okay, you two can wear it. But we thought that would be a blanket rule for everyone in the school. But I remember thinking at the time, we should have gone to the Board of Governors and they should have made a rule. Because then my younger sister had a problem at the school later on when I'd left.
It's so important that somebody takes that first step, don't you think? Because I remember when I was in secondary school, I was the only girl wearing hijab at the beginning anyway. And then obviously people see you and they think, oh, I could do that,
Yeah.
It is
and that's
okay.
That's what I observed.
And then step by step things change. And
and it was locality wide. It was locality wide because I started, and perhaps it was the thing about when you buy a car, you start to notice them on the road. Yeah. Before that, you never saw them. It could be that, but I felt, everybody started wearing hijab around me, all because of me. Allah.
But I remember walking into a secondary school in Barnet, because in Barnet there was forget about hijabis, there were hardly any non-white people, it was very you noticed when there were black people in the class, for example, right? But just 10 or 20 years later, going into secondary school, I remember for my sons looking for secondary schools, I saw walked in, and in one of the schools in Barnet there was a massive image of a girl in hijab doing science, right? And I started tearing up because I remember what a big deal it was that we sought permission and wore hijab, and then you were questioned about it, you were made fun about it, all that kind of stuff that we went through.
I went through all of that stuff, although my area was different from the area you grew up in, but I was still the stranger amongst everybody, and I was not apologetic, and I wasn't shy, and I was outspoken, and I didn't care what anybody was going to say or think. Of course things hurt, but no lasting memories. I can't really remember actually anything, and I was quite extrovert, and I thank Allah I wore hijab, because God knows what I would have done if I hadn't. I remember walking into a library when I was 14 pretending I was French, so this is a schoolgirl wearing her uniform and a hijab with her other friends walking behind her, speaking with the French accent to see l'Arbérienne.
Was that like a prank? Was that your version of a prank?
Feeling in the mood for it that day.
See, now, because I do the same thing at home all the time. I do it with Arabic, I do it with French, I do it with Urdu, I do it with Russian, I do everything.
Yeah, but it's better than me.
And she always says, why don't you just learn the language? So now I can use the same argument. Remember when you went into the library speaking French?
So is that just like an indication of your personality? You just did that for fun.
Personalities change over time. Yeah. Personalities do change over time, and thank Allah. What is it that saying about Muhammad Ali, who said, if a man is 20 years or 30 years on, is still like he was when he was 20, or has the same opinions and ideas, then he's learnt nothing and grown up. Our personalities change as well as we grow older. We should become more mature. We should become nearer to Allah. We should become more balanced and calmer and less prone to erratic outbursts, which I think I am less prone now to.
SubhanAllah, but it also shows you the importance of those local circles, because in the age of social media, it's very easy to kind of get disconnected from real people in your real locality. But I think those circles are just essential. Even my sons just go to a local circle set up by some brothers, and I can just see that kind of feeling of, belonging. Because I was listening to this psychologist, and he was saying, boys especially, when they get to teenage, they have a gang, and it's not about whether they will have a gang or not. They will have a gang. It's just that what kind of gang is that going to be, right? And it just goes to show that those people who do local efforts. I mean, it's just so valuable what they do.
Yeah, but it does take, what they say, a village to raise a child. It's
Absolutely.
not just the parents, it isn't just the mum, and it isn't, you
So
know,
the school is a village, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it does start at home.
Yeah, it
Hence
does.
the saying, family is
definitely.
built in the home.
Yeah. And
But absolutely, no, I completely, I think the family is too small.
And actually, going back onto that, actually, when you say, I was thinking, you know, about some of the things you wanted to talk about, and there's lots of arguments against Muslim schools, and there's just within the Muslim community. I remember a survey done 2005, I think, by the IHRC, and they found that I think 47% of Muslims interviewed, over 1,000 Muslims were interviewed or surveyed, and 47% didn't want a Muslim school for their child. They wanted the best school, whichever one that would
Muslims.
be. Etc. Yeah, these are Muslims. So and of course we know the onslaught against faith schools generally, and of course Muslim schools at the.
But don't those people have a point? Like the point that we're segregating.
Well, it goes back to what you were saying about the village to raise a child, and about making the village, making that sense of normality for the child. You know, this whole thing about the tender ages of children, when their brains are developing, their neurons are developing, their sense of identity and self is developing. How should that be done? Schools in Finland, for example, a very well-known case of Finland, we often say it, they don't start until they're 7. And it's not just Finland, a few other countries.
They don't start school
until 7. And by the time they're 15, they have outperformed children in Britain in maths and science, the PISA tests that they do at 15. So, you know, the fact is, in Britain, we have this tradition of starting children very early. Everything that we do about schooling is very intense and a bit OTT. I personally feel it's overly regulated, overly scrutinised. There's lots of good reasons for regulation and scrutiny. Of course we should have it, but it is very intensely regulated, very intensely scrutinised. From the beginning. And, you know, everything about schooling, you know, even the fact that you're in at 5 and, you know, there are all these rules and sometimes for families, I think it feels like school is such a stressful a part of their family life because it forces them into a mould that they often can't fit because of illness and family problems. And I completely see why we've got regulation the way we are. For example, attendance. You know, when children aren't at school, all the research shows that their grades that they'll get at GCSE will be dependent. Well, Allah knows best about that, but you know, there is a correlation between their attendance and you know, it's a consistent thing they found that, you know, they can actually talk about which grade they can you possibly that you can predict at that point that they might have dependent on their attendance at school, and that goes all the way into primary. So we know it does affect children, even anecdotally. You know, when children go away for a period and they're back at school, how that's affected them, how they're on the wrong foot, how they've missed the previous lesson, you've got to do all of this to try to bring them up to speed. And obviously that multiplies the longer the absence was. However, you know, where you've got families who do have families abroad and have got sick parents, that you're saying to them, you know what, go in some holiday, and the father can't get the, you know, break from, and so on, and then you're only permitted to give them about 10 days. And it all becomes so difficult. So I know there has to be a balance somewhere. One day we'll get there, inshallah, in Britain, to a model of education and schooling that is a lot more child, family, human friendly, and actually staff friendly and workload friendly and so on. Perhaps we'll get there. I mean, schools are doing phenomenal amounts of work, and actually doing, you know, primary schools have come on so far since I was at primary school myself when I was a child in the 70s. So there's great work that's being done in schools up and down the country. But, you know, particularly for children, if we think again about the development of their identity and who they are, and, you know, what they want in life, their concept of life, the bigger picture, all of those things. If you have a school which mirrors the values of home, which gives them the same paradigm and landscape of and allows them also to be themselves, to not feel different and have to keep explaining away their religious beliefs or their culture or their colour of their skin and so on and so forth, all these sorts of things. Although predominantly Muslim schools should have all colours under the sun, you know. However, if the child is always feeling different, they have to apologise. Imagine what that does to the psychology of a child. There's two ends to that. You know, the child can either, you know, suffer from it, or the child can thrive in that. But, you know, what is better overall for the human psyche, for a child? I like the work done done by people like Sue Palmer and her Toxic Childhood books and so on. And this idea that, bringing up children is a process that is determined by the biological and psychological needs of the growing child, and it has a certain rate at which that should develop. And today's fast-paced society, in the way that we have society, we try to force the human being into a mould which is not human, which doesn't really suit the temperament of the human being.
The engineered consumer.
To be honest with you,
So I'll tell you why because obviously I'm pro Muslim schools. I sent my children to Muslim schools, but there is something that I sometimes worry about, and I'll share that with you, and you tell me what you think, and you can tell me as well, Hudhayfah, because I think you've been through Muslim schools all your life, right?
Yeah.
Until A levels.
Until A levels, yeah.
Right. So that's similar to my children, I guess. I worry sometimes. Like, it felt very natural to put them into a Muslim school at primary age. It just felt like they're young, they need to just be around. They need to have messages at school reinforce what's being taught at home, right? But also I wanted them to get into good habits, right? Like habits of the prayer, right? Yeah. And those kind of things. That was very important. Actually, that's in a way more important in secondary school. But then at some point during secondary school, I did start worrying, and I still worry because my sons have just left secondary school, one of them is about to. So I haven't really experienced beyond that. I did start to worry that, okay, like you're talking about your upbringing, and I was quite extrovert as well. I think I thrived in that environment, and it made me more passionate about Islam. Yeah. It made me more inquisitive about Islam and more into da'wah But wasn't that because we were challenged and because we were different?
But again, it was our particular temperament, psyche and so on, but would we have thrived even more in a Muslim school? I mean...
I don't know, because sometimes when you're in your comfort zone, because what I see in a Muslim environment, because you never face any adversity, pretty much. You hardly ever face any adversity.
It's kind of, without blowing my own trumpet, a reference to the point I made earlier about where you had a people migrate from one country with a set of values and a set of cultural norms and bring them to another place, i.e. in this scenario being England the West. And there's such an evident and big clash. It then forces individuals to find some way of either counteracting.
You've got to make sense of it, don't you? And you've got to make your decisions of where do you fit into that picture.
Counteracting that clash, essentially finding a way to fit in, while at the same time holding on to those values that your parents treat as law. I mean, not to that extent, but something that they've obviously seen as quite significant, given that that's how they were brought up.
Yeah, but it's deeper. Iman is deeper than that, though. I have to say, if you were then as a child, if you have Iman, what you're motivated by is your faith in Allah and your desire to obey Him and worship Him.
Probably speaking about those individuals who didn't come from a family where Iman was, quite present in the house. And it's something that they've had to find themselves, through their own spiritual journey once they've grown up and, gone through schooling and they've gone into their 20s at university and they've engaged with other, people in their Islamic society or, a person giving da'wah in the street. But I think those individuals, so the ones who don't have Iman in the house, I think that culture clash or that difference between this way of living and another way of living kind of leads to, asking questions. It leads to thought. It leads to imagination, or essentially more deeper questions, more than just what do I want to be in the future. But it kind of digs at the human psyche and the human's purpose.
Yeah, and I think children who've been in Muslim schools are thirsty to get out into the real world. Yeah, and they're thirsty to get out.
That's what we should ask Hudhayfah. I've got you in front of me. I should ask you, what was it like when you first went to sixth form? So that's the first time, I'm assuming, you were in a predominantly non-Muslim environment. Yeah. What were the...
And having been at a boys' school for 5 years.
Because I also went to a boys' school. Yeah.
Girls as well. Mm-hmm. And be honest.
And in front of your mother.
Yeah. I think...
What were the positives and the negatives? Be honest about both.
Definitely the positives of going through... going through a Muslim primary school and a Muslim secondary school. First, the obvious one is that you're surrounded by individuals like you, in the sense that they've got the same beliefs, same practices. They're all essentially yearning for the same goal. Whether that be a particular grade in study or a higher spiritual achievement. And it allows you to, build and communicate with individuals in that setting. So the one thing which might, pertain to your discussion about pro or anti, faith schools, is that for certain individuals who might not be extroverted, because again, I'm very much like my mother. I'm just I'm a carbon copy. So I'm very extroverted. I talk out again. I'm the one that asks the questions all the time. I have the discussion. I put my name in the hat. And so if I, giving my own perspective, not to say that it's, unique, but you do have individuals who aren't quite as extroverted. And so when they're put in a particular setting, which is controlled, it might dwarf another aspect of their personality or their individualism. For example, their ability, once they go into a mixed environment, to now converse with non-Muslims and understand what their beliefs are, why they might believe in Christianity or Judaism, or why they might not be a Muslim, or why they might be an atheist. So where it might, be detrimental, or in whatever way it might be detrimental,
or have an impact on their iman.
Okay, but what about you? I'm asking about you.
Okay, well, I mean, personally, again,
what was it like? Okay, first day at school.
So
right? First day in that out of your comfort zone in a way, right? Or that environment that you've been used to.
Yeah.
There must have been things that, no matter how extrovert you are, you were nervous about, or that you.
The obvious one is, okay, from my experience going from a boys' school, is all of a sudden coming out into an area where there is no regulation on the communication and the contact between a man and a woman.
Right.
So that's the obvious one. That's the big one.
Right.
And ultimately, when you go from interacting with just boys, I wouldn't say the stereotypical viewers, but the general idea might be that once you now go, to converse with a woman or a female, you might be thinking, you might be a bit dwarfed by the situation, you might feel a bit intimidated, or you might feel, not confident enough. But again, because I take from my mother and I'm quite extroverted, I don't think that affected me so much as it may have affected another individual. But I think what it doesn't help with is...
You were never awkward, in other words.
Yeah, but I don't think it helps in tempering any situation whereby you might nevertheless feel intimidated by a particular interaction, given a particular sensitive topic has arisen in conversation.
So far, you haven't come against any situation where you thought to yourself, if I'd had more experience, if I'd gone to a non-Muslim school, or if I'd had more experience, because it's not just about the Muslim, non-Muslim aspect, right?
Yeah.
There's also the fact that, by and large, Muslim schools are young, right? They haven't had the years and years of investment and years of experience, right? So obviously, sometimes
I think it's a stereotyping assumption, because it's got to do with the staff. It's got to do with the degree of experience they have, with the degree of subject knowledge, pedagogical knowledge, with the degree of social skills and communication skills that they have, and what the national curriculum and the new Ofsted framework for inspection of schools calls cultural capital, which is a controversial, as I know many Muslims know now, a controversial concept, actually academically. However, I think what we all relate to is the idea that, and it happens to children whether they go to a Muslim school or to any sort of school, depends on the circles you mix in, and on the curriculum that you receive and that you're forced to think about, whether you will learn the cultural cues and the cultural capital and background of the country that you're in, that's your country, whether you always see yourself as an outsider on the fringes looking in at and never participating, being a part of. And a lot of it's also got to do with communication skills and English.
Yes, exactly.
We are largely, the Muslim community in this country is an EAL community.
Right.
Even myself.
English as a
additional language.
Yeah.
Even myself, because we don't have that background of richness throughout your family of conversing and thinking and speaking in English. Of course, it's a handicap that a lot of us have overcome. We're pretty good at it. But even then, I think given the sort of background that many people have had, the richness of, and of course, the more educated the family dynamic that the child is being raised in, the better the level of vocabulary and RSE capabilities, as we call them now. All of those things affect children. So, I've interviewed hundreds of people for positions in the school over the years, and I've always been struck by how poor our English skills are as a community, how really poor, and how often we can't really. Sometimes it can be nerves, undoubtedly, but even that's a part of RSE skills.
Mostly is bad grammar.
Bad grammar, and also inability to be able to inability to be able to have an opinion, voice an opinion, express a view, go beyond a few words, have a variety of vocabulary. Our vocabulary is really poor as a Muslim community, actually. And, I'm always struck by comments made about the vocabulary I choose. People shouldn't be struck by, oh, she said another long word. They shouldn't be struck by that.
That's annoying.
Yeah, it's really, because actually we should be using them. So what's happened?
Well, you mean people have...
So it's a problem within any immigrant population. They're struck by it. It's a strange thing to use, words that aren't normally used in conversation, and it shouldn't be, and we should be using it. Should be a part of normal conversation.
That's the thing.
That's basically what
middle class
white people.
They're just words of expression at the end of the day.
They're English.
Exactly.
It's just speaking English.
It's more than that, you see, because we're currently what we're currently
well.
doing in the school is we're developing our children's RSE quite deliberately, and there was a lot of work done by the University of Cambridge in developing a scheme. A framework of skills for RSE, and they developed it deliberately for schools, because there was work done by researchers, and I can think of Hart and Risley, I think, who are American in the States. They did a research study and it was a huge research study which demonstrated that dependent on the child's background is how many words they'll hear over the first 3 years of their life, and there's a massive gap, and that gap starts to emerge a few months after birth, because what they're actually being exposed to in the home by their parents, depending on their parents' level of education. They divide them into 3 categories. They divided them into what we would call benefits. Over there they call it welfare, I think. And then they called it working class. We would call working parents. And then thirdly, they had the professional backgrounds. So people who are middle class, presumably we'd call it here. And there's a massive gap, of the number of words a child has actually been exposed to by the age of 3. And it's a growing gap from, a few months of age. And so on the back of that, University of Cambridge produced this framework of skills for RSE. And there's a fantastic school called School 21 in Stratford, East London, that then took that, worked with University of Cambridge and developed a brilliant scheme for their school. And we've sort of taken a bit of all of that, and we've tried to bring that into our school and start to develop our children's. We started off with vocabulary, then moved on to talk. The idea is that the children should get the vocabulary and the RSE skills, the speaking skills, including facial expression and confidence, that will enable them to, you see, why? Let's go back to the brain's development. When the brain is developing its ability to understand the world, and neurons are being connected. The child is thinking. Now, language is not just language to express with another person, but it's also the language of thinking.
Right.
When you have more language, you can think more. You can come up with more original ideas or different ideas, more questions. It is a tool by which you can learn about the world and excel. What you are exposed to in the home would therefore either limit or liberate that. What I often say to parents in my school, for example, is take your children out on trips and talk with them and talk about the experience. Give them new experiences, give them new vocabulary and talk about it. Allow children's brains and thinking to develop so that they're able to use language to give expression to new thoughts and ideas and views and opinions and so on. So we're doing that quite deliberately now in our school. It's a work in progress. We're nowhere near the finished article, nowhere near like something like School 21 doing amazing work. We've started that, but we really value it. And that's a common problem in the Muslim community, because largely derived from immigrant communities where English is an additional language. Right. So they're impoverished in their thinking skills, all depending, if you've got a child who's grown up with really rich mother tongue in the home, that child will develop their thinking skills in that language. Great. Let them do that. I know it's a challenge when they first go into school, but that they can then develop their English. They will inevitably.
They will,
and they will build their English skills. But because they've developed their thinking skills, it's a translation until they're thinking in English, which inevitably happens once they're going to school.
Well, that's what happened with us, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I can't remember what happened with me too long ago now.
I don't think I knew English when I was a kid, and then as soon as I started school, I was the first person to read.
I remember
because I'd been exposed to Urdu and Quran reading before school. And...
Yeah, I can't remember. It's too long ago for me. I have no idea. But I can't remember. All I do remember, one of my earlier memories, is being in a special class where you're taken out, your intervention classes they did used to have in our primary school at the time, and how very quickly they had to send me away because it was all just too easy for me, and I had to go. But perhaps I did start with Yale. I just can't remember that time of my life.
Well, you remind me of the importance of leadership, because I've really noticed, like even in some of the schools that I've had experience with, when there was, for example, a change in head teacher, and that head teacher was really good. You know, I noticed, I don't think everyone noticed this, but for me, I noticed the teacher standing taller, you know. I noticed just a change in the whole attitude. So do you think it really goes back to leadership as well? We need to have those leaders in those schools, because it's all very well having, thinking that you've got a good team of teachers, right?
You want to hold that foot point for me? I just want to go back a little bit, rewind a little bit, back to the thing about Muslim schools. We have got bad rap and bad press, which doesn't match with the stats. Because if you look at the GCSE results and the Key Stage 2 results of Muslim schools, they are above national average. That's
faith schools
2 days ago.
Though, isn't it,
but even more so for Muslim schools.
Really?
Well, sorry, faith schools in general, but definitely I think more so for Muslim schools, actually. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't bad Muslim schools out there. There are. And I'm not saying that parents haven't got a big part to play in the success of Muslim schools. They do. But there are a lot of factors that go into that success, but surely it's also what the Muslim schools are doing, and the fact that they've given this space which mirrors the home values, mirrors the value of education, mirrors the fact that it doesn't get the child to apologise for being there, but caters for that child and allows that child to express every part of their humanity, every part of their self, and that the child can flourish. Just a few days ago, the 3 top performing secondary schools in this country were identified as Muslim schools. Tawheedal schools, well, they're now called Star Schools. And Tawheedal is an academy. It started off in Blackburn, and their flagship school, now called Eden Girls School in Blackburn, previously called Tawheedal Girls, is number 1. And it's been there for a while now, a number of years, mashallah. But first three positions are all Tawheedal schools. Sure. And they are Muslim schools. They've got a particular model in the way they do things, but they certainly have the Muslim ethos, and they certainly cater for all of that.
In what way were they judged to be the best?
There were a number of different indicators, one being GCSE results, Progress 8 scores, and so on, and Baccalaureate and so on. But there were other things. It escaped my mind at the moment. There were a few other things, uptake at sixth form and so on. There were a few other things, few other indicators. So we've got a large number of very successful Muslim schools, and they're not a rarity. If you look at the 200 odd Muslim schools are in the country, a large number of them are doing incredibly well. So I must say that very, very quickly, because it's really important to understand that. You know, often there is such you could term as propaganda against faith schools and Muslim schools that we fail to remember the achievements and what they're giving back. The children that are coming out of those schools, the young people, are upstanding members of the community. They're going on to do incredible things. And our school's quite young, relatively young. Our primary is 16, 17 years old now, and our oldest children have just finished university, started the first year of work, or gone on to masters and so on. And I think you were in the 4th cohort, weren't you? You're 2010.
I was. How many classes were above me? I think there was 1,
3.
2.
There were 3. You were in the 4th.
3. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you're 3rd year now. So some of them, they're working now. Or they're doing other things. So Muslim schools get a bad press. It's unfair. They should get a good press. They're doing incredible work, and they work so hard to teach the children to be fantastic Muslim citizens or British citizens as a corollary of being a good Muslim. And that is what we need, because, of course, Islam and being a Muslim, largely Islam came to improve the world, not to detract from the world, not to tell the world off and punish the world and all doom, gloom and fire. It's about civilization, and it's about making a godly civilization, humanity that remembers God and worships God. And of course, Islam allows us to be a Muslim minority in a non-Muslim majority in a plural, diverse country like Britain, which is our country. And those are important messages that are being taught to our children through Muslim schools, which then make them very well prepared for life in modern Britain, in plural, diverse modern Britain, as diverse British citizens who are ready to take up their world, to be positive, to demonstrate all of those fundamental British values in their best respect, we should be proud of what these schools are doing.
That's something again that I think speaking from personal experience, I've felt and I've experienced myself is that going out into the wider world, or the big bad world as it's termly called, society is very tolerant, not just tolerant, but very accepting, and welcoming. There isn't necessarily, to a large extent where it's actually noticeable, that individuals ridicule you for your particular beliefs as a Muslim, or individuals, say negative things, out of the, be it on the street or be it, even in, I don't know, some form or the other. So I've personally felt that going from Muslim schools, and going from Muslim schools like my primary school, which really addressed this issue or this idea of fitting in as an individual who is welcome
playing
here
a role in society.
Playing a role in society is what I would probably what you called it. Playing a role in society, and the fact that you can contribute in the same way that any other individual can contribute.
But I would say it's a larger contribution because you're fueled and motivated not by worldly gain, but by pleasing God. Right. And doing good unto your neighbour and to everybody else around you. And we're trying to inspire our children with that message. And we do a lot of very deliberate work right from the outset. I mean, we do it's called the SLP, the School Linking Partnership. It used to be called the Three Faith Forum. It's now called the Faith and Belief Forum, I think. So we have our Year 5s team up with another faith school, and they work together across a year. They have a few sessions together, and they work together, play together, get to know each other. That's really instrumental in. And then we also invite schools in. Our Year 5 will hold an Islam Awareness Week exhibition of the whole school, sort of put together little stalls and things, and call in all the primary schools, and we'll get different schools, a set of children coming across the week to see this exhibition, have a Q&A and meet the children, talk to them. So we do a lot because we understand that, yes, faith schools can be divisive. Let's be honest. Of course, you take any group of people, you can run the risk of them becoming intolerant and narrow-minded. So you have to work to educate them not to be and give them opportunities of mixing. But at the same time, we cannot throw away, just because we're frightened of our children becoming intolerant, we can't throw away the important issue of letting their brains develop and themselves develop as their identity and who they are, and being proud of that, and developing all those positive Islamic beliefs and traits and characteristics and so on, for them to then go out and know on what platform they engage with the rest of the world. I believe in the vast majority of cases, we're seeing really positive results from our schools.
That's really good to hear, and that's really inspiring as well to hear from Hudhayfah, because you've actually lived it, I'm probably projecting some of my own worries, sometimes, when you are bringing your kids up in a different way to the way you were brought up, it can be quite disconcerting, you can start thinking, like you said, of the whole guilt thing, am I narrowing their exposure to things?
I think one thing we need to remember, actually, one thing we need to remember is there is a multiple of paths on the Sirat al-Mustaqim.
Absolutely, yeah.
There isn't like this, sometimes we think everything has to be an exact science. When you do things exactly this way, otherwise, bringing up children isn't. No. And at the end of the day, we are the creation of Allah. We go through so many different experiences in life that all play a part in formulating our personality and who we are. And, we can make the best of that, we can make the worst of that. And everything else around us, all these multiple different factors that are impinging on our developing personalities, play a role in that, and then we have a driving force as individuals to we get to an age of maturity where we're making conscious decisions and we're choosing which path to take and what but by the mercy of Allah, again, it's another mercy of His, there are multiple different paths that we can take. You don't have to be a head teacher to be a good Muslim, you don't have to be a broadcast journalist to be a good Muslim, you can be all of those different things and be a good Muslim. You just have to obey Allah and be sincere and true and do good unto people and fulfill your and all of that is a part of being a good Muslim, doing fantastic things every day, like the unsung Muslim heroes up and down the country. I watched that I play a documentary on the Birmingham hospital where these amazing surgeons on the edge of life, I think it was called, amazing, and one of them is such an inspirational character in the very first episode, a Muslim surgeon, neurosurgeon, what a personality and what humility and what a way with his parents and the sincerity with which he's looking after his patients, the da'wah that he does through his, and that's what IlmFeed is all about, celebrating these unsung heroes, and they should be. I mean, it was that piece of research research, wasn't it? Was it Lancaster University that showed that for every one good news story of Muslims out there, there's 21 negative stories. In some way, the Muslims have been mentioned in a negative way. They examined the words that were used to refer to Muslims, and they found for every one good word, there's 21 negative things.
That's ultimately what dwarfs the positive impact that Muslims might have.
And it affects us as well, of course. It affects the psychology of Muslims. We become very negative about ourselves and our community. But actually,
and then you have the whole inferior complex just by that.
Yeah.
Because then
sometimes we perpetuate it as well. Like, some of the news, the media that Muslims produce is also negative.
I mean, I get that. I can get really negative. Yeah. I can talk about that. What did I often say? I often say we've got these maladies. We have these maladies of the Muslim community, maladies of the mind, maladies of the spirit, maladies. And it's right to be introspective and critical of our community too. But if we overdo that in the face of such hostility, really, I mean, is it hostility? I don't want to judge the intention, because sometimes it's all just about numbers, making, is every community referred to in that way? I don't know if that job has been done. Is news more interested in the negative because people read stories that are negative that scare them? Is that the fact? Out there, and is it about all faiths and all peoples and all groups that negative seems to be mentioned so much more in the media? And is that why, actually, in Britain and perhaps in the Western world, Allah knows, people tend to be in a state of fear all the time, and very risk averse, because we are so fearful that something else might happen because we read it in the paper.
So much
if we've read every single day about a moped robbery, we think we're going to be the next victim of that. But actually, statistically, it's more likely that you might be knocked over by etc. By a car than.
I was just thinking something I wanted to share with you.
I think we were talking about Muslim schools, and before I took us down the path of talking about the successes of Muslim schools, you were going on to a point.
Leadership.
Yeah. Leadership is really important. Of course it is, no doubt. But each of us needs to be a leader of ourselves and our families. And that's the challenge. I think any faith teaches that challenge, and Islam certainly teaches that challenge. Lead yourself. Know who you are by knowing that you are the servant of Allah, you're the creation of Allah, knowing your place in this universe and in the scheme of all things. Lead your life, and then lead your family. The Prophet ﷺ said each of you is
a shepherd.
Yes, each of you is a shepherd, and so the point is that we need to lead our lives, ourselves first, and then we need to lead our families. And yes, we need to lead our communities, and we need to be the role models for the next generations. We need to be the role models for those who might need a little bit of inspiring, a little bit of reassurance in a scary world. So yes, schools need good leadership. Undoubtedly, all the research is out there saying schools should be led well, and schools can often be deemed to be at risk of failure or failed because of poor leadership. It's one of those areas of mine that I'm really interested in, and I've done a lot of training of head teachers actually through the NIDA Trust on leadership and being a head teacher of a school, and I'm personally inspired by the example of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was a leader of himself, his life. He was a leader of his family. He was a leader of his community. He was a leader of humanity. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's example of what it's like to be an amazing leader that has impact. Because what is leadership at the end of the day? Yeah, is leadership that you say a list of rules and everybody follows? You devise an amazing list of rules, or is it all about inspiring people to want to follow a vision? And it may be your vision, but you sell that vision, which becomes everybody's vision, and you inspire people to want to follow that. You
give them a why.
And very much in any organisation, that's what leadership is doing really, really well. It's giving them a why, but persuading them that why is their vision. Right. And this is an amazing vision of the future. And of course, a really successful leader will have a vision it's big, that's aspiring, that's excellent rather than negative, and it's about bringing people on board on that journey.
Do you think it's also about caring about the little things? The reason why I say that is I had a terrific head teacher at primary school. I actually grew up in Hackney, the opposite of Barnet, but for my primary years. And our head teacher used to come in from outside London. He was a very kind of mission-driven type person, Mr. Mines, Ken Mines. I actually made contact with him recently. He runs a garden somewhere. Like, he's completely changed, careers. But he was just amazing as a leader. He was in the classroom, in everyone's classroom. He taught us calligraphy. We were just a bunch of, I'm just going to be honest, we were just like poor Asian kids, right, who nobody would really have cared about. But he actually used to enter us into calligraphy competitions. Those of us who had certain skills, he would push us, up and enter us into things and look out for us. And I just remember one of the things one of the qualities he had was he paid attention to detail.
Yeah.
And he felt very strongly about certain things. My children in my school have got to have good penmanship. And it was like, he took it personally.
That's about his vision.
Right.
His vision. He had a very clear vision, and he was unequivocal about the things that really mattered.
Yeah.
And which is great. Everybody has a different leadership style, and some styles are more successful than others, and the best leaders can actually move between leadership styles, dependent on the sort of epoch, the stage of evolution of their school, the needs of their staff, needs of their team, needs of the school. But attention to detail is important. But at the same time, if you become overly obsessed with detail and too rigid, you need to have that degree of flexibility, because you've got to be able to be prepared to change all of the time. Change in order to do what's best for the school, for those children. And so you've got to be able to be dynamic and flexible and adaptable, and then have enough of a vision to be able to be self-aware of yourself and your limitations, but also that of the school, and also be able to evaluate the school at any one stage, what needs to be done. And then you need to have that unequivocal vision for what needs to happen for education and for those children in that school, and then move mountains to make that happen, I suppose you call. I think schools are very stressful places these days. There is just so much that needs to be done.
I was going to ask you about that. Do you feel that in the current climate, schools have become very self-conscious? Do you feel that there are decisions that they're making, Muslim schools, that they wouldn't have made previously?
I don't know. I can't say. I mean, the phenomenon of Muslim schools is young, very young. Very young. We've got approx 200 or more in the country today. Of those, some are in the maintained sector, voluntary aided or academies or free schools, a very small number. The rest are independent schools. So it's difficult to say, what was it like in the past? What is it like today? I think I like to say to myself that they were all opened with a good intention. But I have to bear, and that good intention being that we want something better for our children. We want high standards. We want them to know Allah. We want to have this village that nurtures them and raises them. But at the same time, and obviously we want high academic standards as well as religious or emotional development and spiritual development standards. But I think at the same time there may well be schools that opened because they wanted to keep their children safe from perceived fears or perceived danger in other schools, and some of those perceived dangers may have been overly hyped. It may be, keep our girls away. There may be schools like that. Personally, I don't have any experience of them. They may exist. I've got experience of loads of schools that really work really hard and really try very hard. And they are stressed places because they're small. They're usually, the fees in these independent schools are low, much lower than what you'd get in a maintained school per child, per head. And they're, staff are accepting lower salaries.
Right.
And how long can staff do that for before they need to go and feed their families and buy a house and do something for their own?
Do you think that's a big thing that needs to change? Because naturally, if you're a very high achieving person, unless you're very motivated, you're going to want to have a higher salary, right? If you can get
I don't think it's just a higher salary. I think it's got to do with, you've got responsibilities in the family. Housing prices, whether rented or mortgaged, it's extortionate today. Extortionate for anybody living in London or anywhere in Britain at the moment. But definitely in the cities in London, the house prices are huge. And when it comes down to do I carry on doing what I love doing, and helping children to excel and be the best human beings they can be, or do I go away to another school and another job or somewhere else because I need to feed my family and put a roof over their head? Well, sometimes it's a no-brainer. They have to do that, and you can completely understand that. But then that leads to staff turnover, high staff turnover rates, which will affect the standards in the school. And as leadership, you're constantly, training and inducting new staff who are right at the beginning of their careers very often. And all of that, that can be something that can hold you back. But you can either see it like that or you can overcome it.
How are we going to solve that?
Well, you see, if
fees.
People who open, this is the problem. If you raise the fees, you close those schools off to a huge number of people, huge swathes of the Muslim community.
We need Hudhayfah and his generation to earn big bucks and invest back into the schools. I think that's what a lot of schools do, right? A lot of the private schools.
I think the other thing is thinking things in new ways. I think independent schools.
But I mean, the community needs to see the
support them.
value of these
They
schools
do.
and invest. And there needs to be
Yeah.
awqaf, there needs to be some kind of
But I think at the same
trust
time
and-
as well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created the human mind in an amazing way. And they say, we've only discovered, or we only use a certain 2%, 10% of our brain at any one time. And when we come together, it's a super brain. You can get a lot of think together. You can also run the problems of groupthink, but you can also get lots of brains coming together to come up with solutions. And you just have to take a risk sometimes. Sometimes we can be risk averse. Oh, you've said that word so many times today. Like we're a bit risk obsessed at the moment. But sometimes we can be frightened to make a change because of the consequences that it might entail. But we might need to make a big change to do things differently. You know that thing they say about if you do things all of the time the same way, you're not going to get any different results. You need to change. So, for example, if independent schools put some money in somehow to having a fundraiser who and I don't know if this would be a popular idea amongst schools, but you have means tested fees. So fees for Muslim schools, the more you earn, the more you pay. The less you earn, if you can demonstrate that you qualify for that sort of discount or dispensation, the less fees you'd pay, and some people completely free. I've got a feeling that independent schools may have to move into that model anyway because of the pressures on the charitable sector and independent schools largely are registered as charities, and there's a growing feeling that these schools that are registered as charities need to do more for the public benefit. So it may well be a model that independent schools move towards anyway, because this would be of a greater public benefit if they could subsidise or reduce or even pay for the fees of some of the children in their school. And that way, because I have noticed that you will have parents who are driving rather expensive cars who are sending their children to school and paying the same fees as parents who are clearly struggling and putting every penny together to get their children into a Muslim school, and some who have to inevitably leave because they can't afford the fees anymore. So there are different models that we could possibly think about, but you're right, one of the models we think about is awqaf, and about Muslim businessmen feeling confident enough to invest in the Muslim sector and without feeling that they're going to associate with a toxic brand that could affect their business in a negative way.
My husband still gets magazines from Imperial and letters.
I get emails
asking him for donations, and so I just got that idea from that there is this culture in the UK at least of
alumni. Yeah.
And
we did start off something with our alumni that again, the smaller a school is and the more people are running around with the fewer people you've got with lots of hats doing lots of things, you just get stretched. You've got all these wonderful wild ideas, but yes, we should be can do people and not can't do. We should be tawakkal ala Allah, let's try our camel, let's try our best, and let's try something different. But again, the people make the decisions need to perhaps have a think around that way, I think.
Does this funding issue affect VA schools, and so schools that are funded by the government?
Get a massive budget increase by the Chancellor?
Well, I don't know how long that will last for. There was something that's come through, but that was after funds had decreased in the maintained sector. Funds were decreased for schools, so that was all part of austerity. The Conservative government's, the Tory government's austerity period, which lasted from the point I think Cameron came in 2010 up until quite recently, when we were told about less than a year ago that austerity is over.
At the party conference.
Quite interesting. We should have all have asked the question that has the deficit been sorted then? No, it hasn't, but here we are. The maintained sectors obviously has received more per head per child than the Muslim independent sector, and we as a school we've just entered. We've got two schools now. We've got our independent school and we've got a maintained voluntary aided school that opened over a year ago in September 2018.
Are they different levels?
Well, at the moment, because our voluntary aided school started with reception year 1, our independent school didn't take in reception year 1 for that year. It stopped taking in fact, it didn't take in reception, but all the children who were in reception that year applied to the voluntary aided school to the year 1 in that class. So that's how our independent went from year 2 to 6 last year, and our voluntary aided school, a maintained school, was reception year 1. This year, we've moved up to year 2 in the voluntary aided, reception through to year 2. It is 2 form entries, so 2 classes per year group, and our independent school is year 3 to 6, and that's 1 form entry, 1 class per year group. Can't remember why we started talking about this. We started talking about this because of funding, maintained schools and funding. Yeah. So it's interesting because for 16, 17 years we've been in the model of, pulling in our belts in the independent, because our fees are below what you would get. Our fees, I think, around 3,600 per year. I don't know if I'm allowed to do that. We're plugging my school. Anyway, so they're about 3,600 per year per child. But obviously, in the maintained sector, you get substantially more than that by the time everything else is added in and you get your dedicated school budget. So, however, because of austerity, we've joined the maintained sector at a time where they're pulling their belts in the. But let's see when this money comes down and
has it affected staff turnover? Has it improved, that kind of thing?
We're too young as the maintained school really to make that sort of comment at this point. I can say to you that as a very, very small school, even if things hadn't changed and things were generous, we would still found ourselves in an interesting situation because we're not large enough yet for economies of scale to kick in. And it's arguable that even when we're full as a two-form entry, that we'll ever get to a really comfortable position. But of course, it will be better than we ever had in the independent and so on. Our independent will get smaller a year on time, by the way, and it will actually phase out. But in the meantime, we're committed to high standards, and we run the two schools seamlessly side by side, actually in the same. We've got new builds, by the mercy of Allah. It's a wonderful new building. Our local authority were very supportive, and it was a very interesting process, the whole building and design process.
So does that mean parents apply separately to the independent? And
yes, two separate schools, two different admissions processes.
And is that because there was just the demand, and so you carried on with the independent as well? Is that...
And we had a commitment to our children, what we didn't want to do, and the Al Noor Foundation, that's a proprietorial body for the independent school, and did the initial application for the voluntary aided school. They made a commitment. None of us wanted to see was that we just suddenly said to parents and children, right, you have to leave now, because next year we're opening a new school and we don't have room for you anymore. You have to go and find somewhere else. So they made a commitment towards those children and those families that, no, we have a vision for you as individuals and as families, and we're going to see that through. And that's what we're doing. And it does mean that the Al Noor Foundation, is putting their trust in Allah and doing a lot of fundraising for that to happen, because, of course, the economies of scale kick the other way for the independent school as it gets smaller. So may Allah reward them. They're phenomenal fundraisers, and when they have a vision and idea, they stick to it and they deliver by the mercy of Allah, by the permission of Allah. And so, I'm proud of being a part of an organisation that does that.
Yeah, when I heard that you were a head teacher, I was so happy, mashallah, because I just remember, your personality and thinking, I would love my kids to go to school with Someera as head, mashallah. So I wanted to ask you about RSE. And what are the can you explain to parents who might not know, what are the changes that are coming in? How do they affect Muslim schools? Are they going to affect Muslim schools? And what about people whose children are in state schools and ordinary, I don't know what to call them.
The changes affect all schools, maintained and independent. They do affect all schools. Now, however, the changes, from my perspective, are positive, because for the first time they lay down boundaries that weren't existent before, and previously schools had laid out their own rules and done things their own way. The government went through a process of consultation with a lot of people before putting this statutory guidance together. Now, the statutory guidance isn't yet law. Well, it's law, but it's not yet applicable. It's applicable in September 2020, next year. The DfE did encourage early adopters, schools, to start to adopt it from September 2019. Number of schools and local authorities decided, no, let's take our time to develop this properly and make sure schemes of work are in place that have been well thought out and done.
So is it a curriculum? Just for people who don't know, is it a curriculum or a guideline or?
There's statutory guidelines that have to be delivered by the time the child finishes at year 6. For example, in primary school, that's relevant to us. There are also statutory guidelines for secondary school. So at the moment, obviously I'm more conversant with the primary school end, but the document covers both. So they've brought in things that weren't compulsory, because remember, PSHE, personal social health education, wasn't compulsory in primary schools, for example. It was compulsory in independent schools, so we had it. It wasn't compulsory in primary schools. It's a non-statutory subject. So this new RSE guidelines actually have some incredible important things in there about health and well-being, and those are really good stuff that's in there. And in fact, even what it's got in there about the relationships education are really important things, and it has been well thought through. I would say there isn't a reason to panic if a school is acting within the spirit of that guidelines, actually, from my reading of it. And I've read it quite carefully, and we've already consulted with our parents, have presented it to parents. There is a need for schools to do what the guidance says, and the guidance says consult with parents, take their views on board. That's an
important thing, isn't
it? When you read it as a Muslim parent and as a faith parent, I think of any faith, it's very reassuring, because schools are expected to consult with parents and take on the religious views or the religious background of pupils, and they're meant to share. And possibly it can be argued, my reading of it certainly supports the suggestion that schools should actually consult in developing the planning of these subjects.
Right.
The DfE is in a position where, it has to show its support of schools, and it has to show its support of parents, and talk about the spirit of the guidelines. And I think it's straddling a difficult position here when people are saying, why isn't the DfE speaking up? There are many parents that like the DfE to stress that part about parental consultation and about the views of religious background, the backgrounds of the pupils to be taken into perspective. You have a large proportion of children from a particular religion and so on and so forth. But I think DfE straddles a difficult line. It doesn't want to obviously be seen to be detracting from its commitment to human rights and to the rights of equality of the protected characteristics, such as groups as the LGBT groups, and of course it has a commitment to promoting their rights. So in communicating to schools, people have felt that the DfE has been slow in making things really clear. I think the guidance speaks for itself, and one has to read it and then produce it and discuss with schools what they make of it. I certainly think that schools can be empowered by that guidance and be given quite clear boundaries. And the other thing it doesn't do, the guidance doesn't tell you that you have to teach any part of this at this age. They say by year 6. By the end of year 6. So where there are a few areas where parents might feel uncomfortable. So for parents from traditionally religious backgrounds, for them, anything that might sound to them as though LGBT views or pro-LGBT views are being promoted is very worrying. And I think, again, one has to look at the guidance and talk to schools, because the guidance itself doesn't require schools to be doing that. The guidance wants to ensure that children are receiving an education that makes them good citizens for 21st century Britain and treat other people with respect, and know and have a knowledge about the different groups in society that are protected under the law, and understand that they're protected under the law, and one should treat them with respect. And as a faith school, I think any faith school wouldn't have a problem with that at all. So we don't. And so we already had a curriculum in which our children were introduced to these concepts, but in a sensitive way, in a faith-centred way, which is what the guidance supports, actually. Right. We are tweaking our curriculum to add in all the great stuff in that RSE guidance that the government's published, the stuff about health and well-being, and we're tweaking our curriculum to ensure that it meets the spirit and the letter of the guidance. But we've already got the vast majority in our curriculum. So I don't actually think there's any reason to panic at all for Muslims. The guidance actually protects parents and families.
So I think the problem, for example, with the case in Birmingham, that was quite in the media.
See, that was nothing to do with this RSE guidance. This RSE guidance actually should solve that problem, in my view, my simplistic view. It was
more about...
it's about things that were already being taught
was implementing
before the guidance. No, because the guidance wasn't out at the time this was all happening.
Okay.
But because the guidance was coming out, it was in a draft form at the time when all of this was happening, people have confused the two things in their minds. So what was going on in Birmingham is that schools were teaching what they wanted to teach about these issues to the children. In particular, the worry was about promoting
confusing children about
gender and LGBT issues, about promoting this, which was at odds with the religious views and faiths of communities that were protesting. Now, at that time, this guidance was not law. It's still not law. It is law, but it's not applicable yet. It's applicable in September 2020. So schools that were already promoting certain ideas and values, they did so because they felt the value of them. They believed in those things. And of course, if you understand the backdrop of society today, and you understand the Equality Act and so on, you can completely see why schools were doing what they were doing. However, if you've got those schools had large proportions of parents who had a particular religious view, there was a stage there that needed to be done in terms of consultation, which one wonders whether how well that was done, which led to this situation. I don't know. To be honest, I don't know why we got where we got over there. But surely if people heeded the government's advice to consult. Clearly, when you've got any dispute, like you've disputes in workplaces, and then the unions have to get involved and they become entrenched and people dig their heels in. Any dispute can come, get to a stage where it becomes very difficult to resolve. And I think that may have happened here. But if things were done well earlier on, you could possibly prevent that from happening. So if you start to promote, if you start to teach LGBT equality and promote it in such a way that parents feel that the moral values of their children are being affected and they're being confused, then clearly there's a stage of consultation that should be happening to shape your curriculum that would avoid that happening. And I think that this guidance does that. Certainly it says it very clearly in black and white that stage should be happening. And right now, in preparation for September 2020, schools should be consulting with parents, and it shouldn't be a symbolic exercise. It should be a meaningful exercise where parents are really involved in that process and a part of that process so that their views are taken on board. The DfE takes its final line as saying the decisions of schools are final. Of course, the schools have to be, but if they have to be the final arbiters. Of course, they have to, right? Somebody has to. You could have all sorts of different people from different groups come in and say, "I want this to a school." A school's got to make a judgment and say, "This is what its curriculum's going to be." So I completely get that. But if a school is really consulted well and taken on board the views of the families it's serving, then surely it will come to a curriculum that will be supported by the parents of that school.
Yeah, alhamdulillah. Thank you for clarifying that, because sometimes if you're only relying on what's on the news, you can get this kind of impression that something's going to be dictated to all the schools and all of our children are going to come home confused. And
I mean, what it says in this guidance, that I think it's one or two lines I coloured in yellow to say, right, I need to make sure. And one is about the different families aspects. But again, if you read the guidance carefully, and it's available for everybody and anybody to see online, if you go to .gov.uk DfE website, dfe.gov.uk, I think it is, or no, education.gov.uk, and you look it up, the relationships and sex education DfE guidance, anybody can read it. And the wording is such that it's very, very easy to teach that from a faith. In fact, I would say that this guidance really helps faith schools because it allows us for the first time in law to teach a potentially difficult subject from the perspective of its faith, whereas previously that wasn't there. So you were left to the whims of other educational experts or authorities to come in and tell you how to do it. And I don't think that was a wise state of affairs. This is really tidying things up. So and it does say it there in black and white that you can teach, a faith school can teach from the viewpoint of its faith perspective, but at the same time does need to teach respect.
Right, Jazakallah khairan. Thank you for that. Is there anything like really anything you're feeling strongly about that you want to share with people, or?
Yeah, I suppose it's about.
There might be teachers listening. There might be other head teachers listening, parents, all sorts of people. If there's any kind of last message that you'd like to give.
Goodness, I've got so many different last messages.
Blending the role of parent and teacher. That's probably a good one.
Yeah.
To realise or to acknowledge that one isn't just a parent, but one is also a mentor, a teacher, an influencer, an individual who builds or who instills the building blocks from young age, as you have me.
He makes me look so good, doesn't he? Yeah. Nobody knows my faults.
She makes me look terrible.
I've only taken one out. Bless. I've only brought one out by four. We all parents and families have challenges, and I've had plenty of mine. They all do, and no two children are the same in a family, and we shouldn't feel ashamed of our child. I think that's a really important thing. You're absolutely, he's absolutely right. It's really important that parents understand that the weight of the responsibility on their shoulder. But I think most parents do. Some of them might hide from it because it's so scary. And I think the key thing about families, get healed. Please get healed, mums and dads. Heal yourselves and heal your relationships. Mums and dad, heal your relationships. If you can heal your relationships, you're teaching children everything they need to know about relationships in their family and in the future. And you're also impinging on the development of their emotional, you're going to give them a healthy emotional development if you do that. You'll get it right, but you'll get it better. No, there's no such thing as perfect and right. Everybody's got challenging circumstances. You can't control what Allah has dictated for you as a trial from one moment to the next. You can't control if somebody's going to pass away and how that might affect you, your family, your children. But you can try and have as much iman as possible and try and have as much sabr as possible, but become healed first. So you are emotionally available to raise your children. And if you're emotionally available to raise your children can develop emotionally well. It's the first building block that iman will be built upon. Spirituality will be, and what you were saying earlier on about socialization and about normality and about routines and all of those things happen from the earliest stage. This is tarbiyah. Tarbiyah is as much spiritual development as it is physical development and learning to clean your nose and how to use a toilet and how to eat and so on and so forth. All of it is tarbiyah. And we can get it a lot better in our homes if we get that emotional and psychological healing and move forward with our families. And for teachers and head teachers in Muslim schools, they're unsung heroes. And school leaders, they're unsung heroes. They're doing incredibly hard work and incredibly good work, and they are trying their best. And I think one thing sometimes I think, when we go back to that comment about how we can judge ourselves and judge the Muslim community too harshly, I think that you can see that at times in schools. We have some amazing families and parents in our schools, amazing people. Sometimes we can have, on the odd occasion, an interaction which you think, would they behave like that with teachers or staff in a maintained school next door? Would they have dared speak in that way? Question mark, I don't know.
You mean like Muslims treating other Muslims badly?
Yeah, with the disrespect that you wouldn't expect if perhaps you'd been a teacher in the school next door, or you hadn't been brown and Muslim yourself. And perhaps all communities have the same issue of treating each other with less respect than they would. And Allahu Alam, with that, we'd need another hour or two to dissect where that comes from. But they should. Everybody out there working for the sake of Allah, wherever they are, need to remember that what we need to fix is our relationship with Allah before even our relationship with each other and our understanding of ourselves. What we need to do is understand what we are doing in life. We need to turn sincerely to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We need to remember His promise. We need to make time for Allah when we're so pressed upon in our time. We were talking about earlier on about schools being stressed, but and Britain being this place that sends its children to school at 5 and this robotic long working hours and so on. How do we make our lives more family friendly, and how do we make them more God-centric? How do we tone down the noise around us and the edutainment around us, and how do we connect more meaningfully with Allah? We've been given the gift of adhkar, the gift of the Quran. There's so many gifts, but we sometimes fail to make the time for it. And I criticise myself as much as I criticise. I mean, it's not a criticism; it's an encouragement, it's an exhortation for all of us to think about when we make those times, and then we have to have mercy upon ourselves, as you were suggesting earlier on. The word insan comes from the root letters nasiya, which means to forget. And every time I look at that story of Adam and alayhi salam and Iblis and Adam's choice. Now, I was looking at that story again this morning, ironically enough. And qadar Allah ma sha'a fa'al, I should say, actually. Now, if our father Adam, who was a prophet of Allah, was forgiven, if he could make that mistake, then surely the mistakes that we make too can be forgiven if we do what Adam did. And the difference between Adam and Shaitan was that Shaitan did not have remorse. Adam alayhi salam had instant remorse. The moment that he did this, and as it says in the Quran, they became aware of their nakedness. At the moment that he did this, he made that beautiful dua. رَبَّنَا ظَلَمْنَا أَنفُسَنَا وَإِن لَمْ تَغْفِرْ لَنَا وَتَرْحَمْنَا لَنَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. That, oh Allah, unless you forgive us and have mercy upon us, we'll become of the losers. He immediately had remorse and immediately made tawbah, and the tawbah was sincere. But he had to taste the consequences of his deed. So he was told in the same word, ihbitu, out of here, come out of here, from here. But the same word was said to Shaitan. But he will live in the earth for a time, and then he will return. And we have to do what Adam alayhi salam did. When we as insan, nasiya, when we forget, when we fall short, when we sin, we make sincere tawbah. to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We don't hold on, we don't follow the path of shaitan, which is what he's trying and egging us on to do, of being remorseless and carrying on in our dalala, in our error, but rather we take the path of Adam alayhi salam, and our capacity that Allah has given us to be sincere, to repent to him and turn back to him. And at the same time, we need to remember that this theatre of life that we live in is for a fixed period of time, and our abode in the hereafter is forever. And that we need to have that sabr to see it through. And very often this nasiya insan, this forgetful human being, is going to forget that and be, like Allah says in the Quran, khulika halua, and also impatient, niggardly, fretful, forgetful. This is the nature, and weak. Also we have these tendencies inside. So therefore forgive ourselves. We have a tendency, and all we need to do is remember the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, kullu bani Adam khata'in wa khairul khata'in at-tawwabin, that all of the children of Adam are sinners or mistakers, and the best of them are those who frequently repent. And as we know, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that Allah is more delighted with repentance of one of us than we would be. We would be delighted if we had lost our camel and all of our belongings in the middle of the desert and had given up all hope and laid down to die. And yet we open our eyes and we see our camel above us with all our belongings, and we cry out in delirious joy, "Oh Allah, you are my servant and I am your Lord." And a word of shirk in our ecstatic joy. But Allah is more delighted with us when we make tawbah than this man. Subhanallah. And this man said a word of shirk. This is what we need to understand who Allah is. And that's what I'm saying. We are, as human beings, we are liberated from the yokes of despair. I'm not saying we should definitely go for emotional psychological healing. Definitely. Just like we would for a physical ailment. We should definitely do that. But we are liberated from the yokes of despair with these gifts that Allah has given us, this gift of tawbah. And that would be my message there. And for Muslim schools as well, I think I would say, let's look again and again at our curriculum and our teaching and our training of staff and what we do, because we need to be fit for purpose. In today's world, our children are, at risk of all of the maladies of today's world that are affecting all of the children out there. Our children are falling short and suffering just as the other children are out there. And the effect of social media and the internet on our children is horrifying, if not concerning. It's horrifying. And we have to understand that we need to rise to that challenge in terms of the tarbiyah as families and parents and as schools, to make our da'wah and our education and our tarbiyah fit for purpose, fit to help children to know who they are, to give them a sense of purpose and identity and iman, and plant those seeds, help children plant those seeds really well, so that they can become confident children with the skills in this really confusing world, toxic world, in accordance to Sue Palmer, and she's speaking some really wise words there. A toxic world, give them the skills to be able to navigate that world and grow in their iman. Remember, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us to worship and serve him. And we have the responsibility to walk in the footsteps, especially as Muslim educators, but all parents, but as well as schools. We have the responsibility to walk in the footsteps of the messengers and of the messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to help the next generations to become abideen as well, to become abidun, the servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be able to be the worshippers of Allah, to worship Allah as he deserves to be worshipped, knowing that we will always fall short. وَمَا قَدْرَ اللَّهِ حَقَّ قَدْرِهِ, that we have not appraised Allah with the true appraisal, with true estimate, and that we have to keep trying to do that and ensure the next generations to come do that too, because Allah is deserving of all glory and honour and worship. And those signs are written about us all around us in the world around us. And it's our duty to schools to draw our children's attention to those signs.
Jazakallah khairan, Someera. Really inspiring words for all sorts of people. Jazakallah khairan. And Hudhayfah, do you have any last thoughts or any advice that you'd like to give?
Being young, first of all, is a difficult process for a multitude of reasons. Yeah. I think the biggest one in today's age, it might have been different in the 90s and the 80s, but
the olden days.
Yeah, the olden days. The olden days, the black and white days.
That was before my time.
Okay. Well, Yeah, so I think the most obvious one is the feeling, particularly in today's very kind of toxic and constricted and suffocated society and environment, is wanting acceptance by another individual just for the sake of, you know, being accepted, just for the sake of wanting a popular image, just for the sake of wanting to be popular and being liked by other individuals,
Or validated.
feeling valued ultimately. Though I think a feeling of value is something which can be positively sought after, but necessarily yearning after something which doesn't yield anything beneficial, because ultimately value, you know, that's quite subjective, and you can deliver value. For example, you can be valuable to a young person who, you know, you're mentoring, but this yearning of wanting to be acknowledged by a particular group of, you know, boys, or a particular group of girls, or a particular individual, just for the sake of your own self-pleasure, or your own you know, your own desire, I think is something that we've really got to get rid of, because that's, I think, at the forefront of what drives a lot of people away from, you know, either their religion or their studies, and drives them towards quite, you know, unnecessary activities, whether that's getting involved in gang crime, whether that's getting involved in, you know, particular crowds. Ultimately, I think it is grounded in this wanting of approval from a particular group of people, and you've got to get over that, because ultimately that will lead you to nowhere. Ultimately, it will lead you to nowhere. It won't lead you anywhere in terms of, you know, wherever you are going with that particular group. For example, joining a particular gang. You know, you have this, you know, this vision that, you know, these guys will be with me, you know, for the rest of my life. We'll get through tough times, this and that. But ultimately, that never happens, and it's never happened.
So how do you stay focused? How do you stay away from? Because I'm sure you get tempted. You know, well, everyone wants to be accepted. Yeah. Everyone wants to be in and popular. And how do you, what works for you?
I think I'm at a point at the moment where, again, like my mother, I'm not fazed about being accepted by a particular group of people. I'm not fazed about an individual not liking me because I am the way I am for a particular... I mean, I've not come across that. You know, most people, if not all people, are very accepting, very welcoming. But I'm in a position where now I'm comfortable in myself. I know who I am. I know why I am who I am. And I know exactly what I stand for, what I would support, what I wouldn't support, and the reasons for why I make those decisions. And so for me personally, I've overcome a feeling of wanting to be part of a particular group, or wanting the approval of a particular person, because I know it's not important. Ultimately, we have much bigger things to be wary of, to be concerned about. Whether that's, you know, our religious achievements, our religious obligations, seeking the pleasure of Allah, following the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or having just a more broader and more beneficial worldly goal. You know, pursuing a career by which you can deliver benefit to a larger number of people, be it through charity work, through human rights work, through representation for underrepresented groups. And that is truly something that can deliver benefit. And if I can add some value there, then I know that I will be benefiting a larger group of people than if I was to just, you know, say a particular thing which isn't necessary, which goes against my religious beliefs, perhaps, just so, you know, someone else can, you know, someone who I look up to can laugh, or someone else who I you know, find cool can say, oh, you know, you're really cool. So I think it's getting past that stage and thinking that that's not really important, because that doesn't define who I am. I am who I am, you know, because of X, Y, and Z. And overcoming that, I think, is definitely a big challenge. I think now, especially because of social media is, if you use it for the wrong reasons, or if you are exposed to it in a wrong way, you know, lethal, fatal for an individual, for their confidence, for their understanding. We hear so many stories of individuals who, you know, take their own life because of something that happened over social media, or because of a particular stance in social media which was attributed to them, and they felt the need that, you know, oh, because this and this has happened, I've now got to take my life. And you know, it is very unfortunate to hear that, and that's just kind of the climate we live in today, and the climate that young people are living in today. Very different from when yourselves, you know, were growing up. Not to say that
it's much harder now.
Yeah, I mean, not to say that, you know, we're playing the victim card and all elders should now sympathise with us. You know, should sympathise with us because we're all off the rails. Not necessarily to say that, but just to say that social media can either be your friend or it can be your enemy. And it's about using it for the right purposes. You see, for example, on Instagram, you've got lots of really wonderful pages which promote Islamic sayings, ahadith. You see loads of pages which promote charity work. And it's about wanting, first of all, to involve yourself in some sort of self-development.
In the good stuff.
Yeah, in the good stuff. Because again, as you mentioned previously, referencing the tie your camel and then put your trust in Allah. Nothing will happen if you don't take a step. Nothing will happen if you just ask for something. If you make dua to Allah, you say, oh Allah, give me this, but you don't make an effort for it, you won't get it, regardless of what happens, regardless of how sincere you are. You need to take the step, hence why you've got to tie your camel. So it's important just to take that first hurdle, just to say, you know what, I'm going to take a step back, I'm not going to do what you do, because I understand that I need to make a change. And if I don't make the change myself, no one will do it for me. And I can have fanciful imagination, I can have wonderful ideas of where I want to be, but if I'm not prepared to make an effort myself, then I should not expect to, reach that goal. And ultimately, it's always down to the individual.
Jazakallah khairan, great advice. And I guess ultimately, if we keep pleasing Allah in our mind as the highest purpose, eventually people will be pleased with us. But if we make them our focus, then neither Allah nor they will be pleased with us.
That reminds me, if I can, it reminds me of where a person who, doesn't indulge themselves in good, indulges them in evil, then that person is disliked by Allah, and Allah tells the angels to dislike that person, and then from that the people on the earth dislike that person. But conversely, if a person engages in good, they're involved in charity work, they're always remembering Allah with a particular group of people, or even they're just making an effort, that they don't have to be a huffaz, they don't have to be a scholar, but they're just making some sort of sincere effort, then their name goes to Allah. Allah loves that person, and then Allah commands the angels to love that person, and then not just that, the people whom Allah loves will also love that person. So it proves your point exactly, that if you put Allah first, you can bet your bottom dollar that you will find contentment in this world.
Although, of course, we wouldn't bet, because that's haram.
Of course we wouldn't bet, but figuratively speaking.
It's all hard work.
So, mashallah, you mentioned that all children are different, but, they've all got something special about them in their own way, right?
Yeah. And that's what we've got to remember. All our children are special, and all of them need to be loved, and all of them we're going to be held to account for on the Day of Judgment. And all of them have had a different perspective of their childhood and their perspective of us and the way we've been with them. And we just have to admit, it doesn't matter how painful that is for parents, it will be painful to hear, but it will happen. They're going to be, each of them, when they're grown up, when they've become baligh, each of them a different separate soul accountable to Allah, and they've got their own life to lead and their own views to have, and they won't all necessarily be wonderfully perfect robotic children. And of course, children are not, they're not robots. And we have to also remember that where we are tested by our children, Allah bless and guide them all, Ameen.
Ameen.
The prophets before us were tested. Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam had 10 sons. We don't know how many daughters, but he had 10 sons. 12 sons. 10
more
plotted
10.
to kill one of them.
Yeah.
10 plotted to kill one of them. The best one of those 10 said, oh, let's not kill him, let's just throw him down to the bottom of the well so somebody else can take him away, far away from us. This
was the good one.
And he was the good one out of those 10.
Yeah.
But still, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mercy upon those children.
Right.
And those children, inevitably, when they grew up, many scholars say they became prophets. And if they didn't become prophets, we know in the Quran, in the story of Yusuf, that they repented to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they were sorry for what they'd done. And we know the reply of Yusuf alayhi salam to them. So I think that's really something we need to remember as parents.
Yeah.
Never give up and never despair of the mercy and the guidance and His accepting our dua.
But also, I guess, allow them space to grow, to find their way. Because I think that's one of the things that I really loved about my parents, that they literally were quite hands off a lot of the time, and I found that very hard to be.
Gave you room. It is that whole thing about that. The best example to use is of the cocoon and the caterpillar. If you try to open the cocoon, the butterfly will not emerge; it will die. Its wings will not fill with blood or whatever it is, and be able to spread and fly away as a butterfly. And that's the thing about over mollycoddling our children. We damage them. They need to be. But the difficulty difficulty of parenting, obviously with all our own baggage, is knowing the balance.
Yeah.
And it will constantly be in that dilemma. Parents will. It's another form of trial. We'll be in a dilemma all of the time. Did I do something wrong?
Yeah.
You know, what do I do next? How do I deal with this situation? And all that we can do is put our trust in Allah, make dua, and try and do the best. And sometimes the best is letting go. Sometimes the best is give them space. Sometimes the best is they're going to commit a sin, but you can't do anything to stop it. You know, and thank Allah, it's not a major sin. You know, because of mine. And you know, it may be that some parents are worried about major sins, but there's only so much a parent can do.
Yeah, and I think also have faith that at some point, all of that pouring in that you did in the
Which
early
is why
years
you have
is
to
gonna
heal
come
yourselves, because it
back
has to
out.
be done with that love, with that, you know, space. If you are in emotional or psychological angst and agony yourself, you're not there emotionally to hear your children emotionally and help them develop emotionally. And that is a precursor to all forms of development in a child.
Jazakallah khairan. And we are going to wrap up, but I can't wrap up without asking you what it's like to be a grandmother, because I just think it's so cute, and I just can't wait myself actually to have grandchildren of my own.
Yeah.
What was it like?
The first overwhelming feelings are of unconditional love.
Oh.
Unconditional love in a way you never felt for your own children. Let's be honest. Let's be honest. With your own children, you were just frightened the whole time. You were just in an angst the whole time, and gone into worry and panic the whole time. If they did one step out of line, what does that mean? You know, what will become of them? And also you have the responsibility as a parent to clothe them, feed them, send them to school, do everything. And it's a very chaotic, difficult, an entire responsibility. Chaotic, difficult. You know, at that time, people are usually in the beginning of the relationships, the beginning of their family life, and it's constant change, and it's really stressful and difficult. But as a grandparent, you've done all of that. And it's just, you know, muscle memory. When you swim, you can often swim again many years later, though you haven't. Yeah. You've got muscle memory. Same with archery. I did a little bit. And you get this muscle memory, which is really important. And I think we have a learning memory. Yes, by doing it again and again, you strengthen neurons and you get better at any activity. But when you've had children, it's such an intense experience. You had plenty of practice. When you have grandchildren, you've almost reached a point, I think, for many parents, of intuition. You've seen it before, you know it, and you fall into the role naturally. But you have this unconditional love that is devoid of the worry and the responsibility. And that's the reason why so many spoil their grandchildren. But you know, there has to be that love. You should be supplementing, not taking over. I don't know what my daughter would make of this, but you should I don't know how I am actually, but you should be supplementing, not taking over. You have to remember that. Supplement and respect, and not take over. But at the same time, that I was really struck with how important a role I play in the life of my grandchildren. I've never expected that, and I've really learnt about that. And I'm such an important person in their life, and that is a part of that village experience for raising a child, and for their tarbiyah. And it also gives them what I never received as a child. I didn't have grandparents. I didn't have relatives. They've got this extra circle of love and acceptance that I never received, which helps their personalities to develop and their emotional development to be more healthy, and for them to feel wanted and secure, and not in search of, as Hudhayfah was talking about, attachment with gangs and other groups and people who make them feel cool and validated, because they're getting that from their parents, they're getting that from their grandparents, they're getting it from the extended family. So that was my initial impressions and so now I've moved, as they've got older, I've moved to the responsibility side more and more of, you know, my responsibility for trying to give as much tarbiyah as I can to my grandchildren.
Oh, Jazakallah khairan. Thank you for sharing all of that with us. We will wrap up now. So dear listeners and viewers, Jazakumullah khairan for joining us. Do share this episode with your family and friends, and perhaps tell somebody about it who doesn't listen to it already, because we really want to spread these positive messages and stories far and wide. Inshallah, with that I will leave you. Subhanak Allahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum.